to the Des Moines Register's editorial board. This is our endorsement interview with Senator Rand Paul, who is a candidate for the Republican nomination for the president. I'm Lynn Hicks, opinion editor, and our editorial board will introduce themselves.
I'm Clark Kaufman. I'm an editorial writer here at the Des Moines Register.
I'm Brian Smith, I'm the engagement editor.
I'm David Shivers, the president and publisher.
Emily Nash, executive editor.
So we always start with the question, why should we consider endorsing you?
Well, I think I'm probably the one candidate who looks beyond party more than any other candidates. I'm pretty ecumenical in laying blame where blame deserves to be laid. I think that the country's number one threat, both to national security and to the country, is our debt. We borrow money at $1 million a minute, and frankly, I think it's both parties' fault. In fact, the loudest voices in Washington for continuing to spend money we don't have actually are coming from the right. They are saying that we need more money for military spending. In order to get it, they have to go to those on the left who want more domestic spending, and so both get what they want, but the taxpayer gets stuck with the bill. In the most recent busting of the budget caps and increasing the debt ceiling, we actually took money from Social Security to spend on immediate concerns. And I don't think people from either party really think that we ought to be spending the Social Security money on either immediate military or domestic spending concerns. I'm the only one really pointing that out. On the Republican side, you have people who I think are actually very liberal on military spending. Cruz, Rubio, the rest, they would throw Rubio's advocating $1 trillion in new spending for the military. I think that's just as bad as a liberal Democrat asking for $1 trillion for domestic spending. It's bad for the country to spend money we don't have, and I think there ultimately will be ramifications.
How do you deal with that level of spending, particularly with regard to the most recently passed omnibus bill, which included things like a destroyer that the military didn't even want, but it finds its way into a budget? How do you address that kind of spending?
Part of it's the process. If you put all the spending together in an omnibus or a continuing resolution where everything's glommed together, there isn't enough time or effort for oversight. So your government right now lurches from deadline to deadline. Midnight, government, you have a choice. You either shut it all down or you keep it open and keep doing the same thing we've always done, which is wasteful. We have not passed each 12 individual appropriation bills since 2005. And so as a consequence, we just glom it all together. The spending bill in December was 2,242 pages. Nobody read it. Nobody had an idea what was in it. And so I just refused to vote for any of them that are put together that way. We spent $43 million in Afghanistan last year on a natural gas station. Well, one, we don't have any money to be spent in Afghanistan because we got to borrow it from China to send it to Afghanistan. Two, not many people have a car in Afghanistan. And three, nobody's got one that runs on natural gas. But somebody thought it was a great idea for the military to be green. Sound like a good green project. Let's build a natural gas station. But that's the kind of money that's just thrown away. And we spent $800,000 in Afghanistan last year on a televised cricket league. So Afghanis can feel good about themselves and they can now watch television and see cricket, except for most people in Afghanistan don't have TVs, so it's, once again, just throwing good money after bad.
There's nothing you can do about that if you're a member of the Senate. What do you do as president?
Well, no, I think there are things you can do, you can try to do both. I'm a loud voice for saying what they're doing is wrong. I lectured my fellow senators till 3 in the morning. I got them all, swearing at me and coming over and telling me where I can go under their breath. And frankly, something's got to change. And the system will eventually break. And it can break in various ways. You can have a system so over-leveraged that we have another 2008 kind of problem. But you can also have a system where we create so much money in papering over our debts that you have a crisis of confidence in the currency. And the thing that I believe about panics, and others believe this, is that panics, you have a gradual decline and loss of your currency's purchasing power, but you can have abrupt things that happen that are like a panic. And I still think that we have banks that are too big to fail, we're over-leveraged, we have a stock market that I think is, an illusion. And I think there still is a possibility of panic underlying the entire economy.
the op-ed that you wrote for us, that we're going to be running soon, you talk about, I mean, one of the things you talk about is having, forcing some of these big bills, forcing Congress to take more time on them, for example. I mean, is that one of the solutions that, or whatever?
Maybe. I mean, people have put forward various proposals on how we can force people to read bills, like maybe they have to sign saying they read the bill, but they're mostly dishonest, so you'd have to accept their signature as being honest that they read the bill. I think the better way to do it probably would be to say that you have a waiting period. So what I proposed is for every 20 pages of legislation, you have to wait one legislative day. So like Obamacare was 2,000 pages, we'd take 100 days to read it. What happens is most of this is done behind closed doors by a few people. And so the leadership loves omnibus and everything, because what it is Republican leader sitting across the Democrat leader, and what do you want? What do I want? And a few things get stuck in there. So like Republicans wanted the ability to export oil. They threw that in there. Democrats wanted permanent tax credits for earned income tax credit. And so they kind of both got what they want. But if you're someone like me who really thinks that the debt is a problem, I got nothing, And so, but it's all done by just a handful of people. The appropriations process, if we did individual bills, it really spread some of the power around. It would also get some of the light of day. The process would be seen and debated in the open.
You're not a big fan of the Clean Water Act, I take it.
It depends. I actually would vote for the Clean Water Act. I think that it should be illegal to dump benzene in the river, or lakes, or streams. What I don't like is what it has evolved into, in the sense that I think the original Clean Water Act says you can't discharge pollutants into a navigable stream. I think it's evolved into something where dirt's now called a pollutant and my backyard is a stream. And so I think we've taken our eye off of the prize. The prize is really lakes and streams and rivers and bodies of water. And we put a guy in jail in southern Mississippi for 10 years for putting dirt on his own land. In Morristown, New Jersey, we put a Hungarian immigrant in jail for 3 years, fined him $250,000, once again for putting dirt on his own land. The Hungarian owned a piece of commercial crappy property that had rusted automobiles and was a junkyard. 7,000 tires littered the ditches, so it flooded because the tires were in the ditches. He cleaned it up. He picked up all of the rusted automobiles, cleaned up the tires, but it still needed some elevation improvement, so he put dirt on it. They said it was a wetlands. Well, an old junkyard with a bunch of crap on it's not a wetlands. And so I think what happens is you take focus away from things like the Everglades that we can all appreciate, and you're talking about some guy with a junkyard, you put him in jail, and you fine him $250,000. So we're conservatives, it's not that we don't like the environment, we're worried about the overstretching of it. There's a guy with a cattle pond in Wyoming right now, they're fining him $37,000 a day for building a cattle pond without the right permit. We want the federal government to leave us alone.
Build a pond, I mean, he dammed a stream.
Right, there's a water structure.
Without the permit.
I know, but he had local permits to do it. He didn't have a federal permit to do it. But there's also local laws that say, and even some of the federal laws say that cattle ponds are exempt from some of the rules that have been done. But the bottom line is, look at the pond. Wildlife feed in the pond, birds come and land on the pond. It's a beautiful little pond. And he didn't stop the water. You shouldn't be able to starve your neighbor with water. The water accumulated in the pond, and now the water runs out at the same rate that it runs in the other side. So, I don't know. I would argue that those decisions ought to be made more locally. I guarantee the local city council wouldn't do that to him. Federal government in a distant capital is doing that to him, but that's the kind of case that outrages conservatives.
The fellow, I think it was in Mississippi, this Robert Lucas, the guy who spent like 10 years in prison. I mean, he wasn't sent to prison for putting dirt on his land. He was sent to prison for conspiracy to defraud and mail fraud and...
Yeah, no, but this is the way sort of the Washington Post will sort of say stuff like that. But realize the RICO Act was supposed to be for gangsters. So what we've taken something is a real overstretch, and we have abused things like the RICO Act. Conspiracy, it sounds really bad. Conspiracy. He's convicted of conspiracy.
Well, because it was his and his daughter.
Well, his daughter, it's like, oh yeah, it's like Al Capone, and they're getting together to do some sort of evil thing, and they're going to we're going to get together, we're going to conspire, I'm going to dump benzene in the river. They were putting dirt on their land to raise the elevation of their land.
But it was federally protected wetland, is what I'm
It's not
saying.
a wetland. See, I know this is the other problem. It wasn't wetlands. Wetlands used to be defined, and until George Bush I came in, he came in and he unilaterally, through executive action, redefined what a wetland was. He doubled the amount of wetlands. So here's the rub. Many of us want to protect real wetlands, but we want you to leave us the hell alone on our property, okay?
Yeah.
This is property that had trees, it had no standing water. It's not a wetland. It's a wetland by some crazy liberal who wants to get their tentacles, I'm serious, by some crazy liberal who wants to get their tentacles in all of our land. The new waters of the U.S. regulation that Obama's doing, 97% of Iowa could be under federal control. I guarantee you most Iowans don't want that.
Well, the problem with this case, though, and I know you've characterized it before as somebody being sent to prison for 10 years for putting dirt on his land, but he was actually building home lots on these wetlands. And
Well, first of all, there's no standing water and it's not a wetlands. Yeah, well, you can interview me or you can give a speech. The problem is that it's mischaracterized by liberals. I believe in land rights. If you want to know what I believe in land rights. I think he was sent down the river, and I think it's an outrage that in our country you're going to put a guy in jail for 10 years for putting dirt on his own land. The federal government's got no business on that. The federal government's got no way. It wasn't wetlands, there's no water on it. We're not talking about the national parks here. We're talking about a real estate development. Federal government has no business coming and telling him what to do with his land. Do you know that wetlands can be defined by the jury? You know what the definition of a wetlands is? A lot of times the jury has no idea what penalties are either. It was a very confusing case.
Yeah.
But you know that if you want to define a wetlands can be defined by 300 different plants. Doesn't have to be water or wetlands. You can do soil samples. If you can find water in the soil, you can call it wetlands. You can have your ditches blocked up by 7,000 tires, and you get flooding because the damn ditches are blocked up. You unclog the ditches and you go to jail. We have a government that has gone way too far, and as a consequence, they don't have enough money or time to spend protecting the Ohio River and the Mississippi River, things that they should be doing, the Great Lakes. We have a government that's grown too large and too obtrusive.
You might still disagree with me on this, but take the EPA out of the equation and just look at the people who bought the homes that this fella developed. And they had raw sewage coming up through the ground and running
If
through the
you have a problem with sewage, you do have a local course of action or cause of action, and you can take care of that locally. Putting this man in jail for 10 years was a trumped-up charge. Nobody actually had made any action against him. I think there were 1 or 2 complaints from like 300 people.
Yeah.
And then you know what the government did? The government came to town and said, we can get you money. Show up in the auditorium, and we think we can get money out of this rich guy. So they encouraged people to actually have suits against him. The federal government should stay the hell out of this. The federal government's got no business in a local private property real estate development down there. And apparently some of this developed. I was just there. I was in Jackson the other day talking to the original reporter who wrote on this. And he told me that a lot of it had to do with a personality conflict between some sewage permit guy, some septic tank guy. One of the things he's convicted of is not having a federal license to put a septic tank in. There is no such thing. There never has ever been a federal license for putting septic tanks in. It's a local issue, and it ought to be a local issue. Septic tanks ought to be taken care of by some local supervisor. But 10 years in prison is outrageous. Guy's 70 years old. It's an outrage, and people can argue otherwise. But this is taking our eye off of protecting the Great Lakes, protecting ponds, streams, rivers, because it became a ridiculous notion of what a wetlands is.
Talk about why you say the Obama
I
administration
think I'm
has
getting less likely to get the endorsement.
a hostile approach to traditional energy development, and how
Who
do you
does?
change that? The Obama administration. You had said they had a hostile approach toward energy development. Why is that, and how would you change it?
Well, you know, we have a big and growing country, and we need more energy, not less. So in my state, we've lost about 10,000 jobs. I think about 40,000 jobs in Appalachia have been lost. Appalachia has struggled for decades with a lot of poverty and very, very little industry. And so President Obama came in and destroyed the one industry we had, which was the coal industry. And we resent that. I think as a consequence, he basically destroyed the Democrat Party in our state too. I'm not lamenting too much about that, but you need all energy, you don't need less. And so destroying coal, we still get, up until a few years ago, we were getting half of our electricity across the U.S. from coal. Now I think it's still about a third. But there's going to be a time, it's pretty cold out here. Y'all are going to wake up cold if you're not able to use coal, as part of our electricity. The other thing that's misguided by environmentalists is thinking that somehow the situation's a lot worse. If you want to know when the dirtiest decade for air was in our country, when do you think that was? The dirtiest decade for air?
70s?
Probably 1890s. The Industrial Revolution, it's kind of what China's going through now. They're going through the Industrial Revolution, and they've got really dirty air, they've got really dirty streams. We went through it, and we actually probably peaked at our worst in 1890, maybe 1910, 1920. We've been getting better ever since the 1920s with our air quality and with our water quality. And we refuse to sort of accept that, and I think we have an alarmist mentality now where we're just going to shut it down, by golly, we're going to shut it down. Not only do I object to that because it's crippling my state, but I also object to it because it's been done unilaterally by edict by the president, and that's not what the Constitution intended. The Constitution intended that legislation would be done by the legislature, not by the executive. So for many reasons I object to it and think that it's wrong what the president's been doing.
What about the approach to climate change?
I'll be more specific, I guess, with the question.
I guess how would you address sort of the warming of the planet?
I think it's best not to get too alarmist over the situation and draw conclusions that may or may not be valid. For example, do you think clouds make us warmer or colder?
Colder?
The net effect of clouds is cooling, but if you embrace global warming, they say as we warm we're going to get more cloud mass, but now they're saying it's going to be a warming, not a cooling effect. And so they're projecting something. Their modeling is based on something that's not currently true. The modeling also has shown that some of the people who have looked at it, particularly like the cherry tree rings, that there's been some cherry picking, no pun intended, of some of the data to make things look worse than it is. As far as if you look at the climate, and I'm willing to acknowledge that man has something to do with the climate, but the question I always ask the people who want to shut down all the industry and they think the Statue of Liberty is going to drown, we're going to be underwater in a few years, these are alarmist, and it's sort of, I think, crazy kind of talk about something like that happening within 100 years. But what I ask them is, do you think the sun has anything to do with the climate? And the question is, and I think this is an unknowable thing, and you'd have to estimate how much of nature's change has to do with the sun and how much has to do with man. If you look at the history of the globe's like 4.5 billion years old. We've had enormous climate shifts throughout that. We've had carbon hundreds of times, if not thousands of times higher than it is now. So we've had a fluctuation both in carbon in the atmosphere, and we've had fluctuations in the temperature. If we were going through a natural cycle, let's say we're going through a natural warming cycle, as it's warmer, the oceans do release more carbon as well. As it's colder, they release less carbon. None of it's an excuse for stopping or slowing down or trying to control pollution. Just like going back to the Clean Water Act, I'm not against the Clean Air Act. I'm not against trying to control pollution. I am against people who have become so dogmatic that it's a religion for them, and they think if you're wrong somehow that you're a Neanderthal, you don't accept science. There's a healthy debate, and people, I come from a scientific background. People are taught to be skeptical and taught that the truth comes from data, and you should keep looking at the data to see what the truth is. But to mandate that we're going to close down, and shut off all the coal industry, I think is an overreach.
Do you think there's any role for the federal government in encouraging or incentivizing renewable energy sources?
I think there's a role by federal government in controlling pollution. And I don't really, I'm not a big fan of the federal government. You know, the federal government makes mistakes. So all the environmentalists say, oh, we got to have ethanol. Ethanol's great. Now what do most of the environmentalists say? They're not really that pro-ethanol anymore. They think it may actually be less clean than doing other forms of energy. So really, the reason why you don't want to allow central planners to make decisions for the entire economy is that if you give that power to one person or like a Politburo that decides sort of what goes on, if they're wrong, then the decision is foisted on the rest of us. Whereas the marketplace will make decisions on, the cheapest form of distributing energy and electricity. I'm fascinated by solar panels. I'd love the idea of having solar panels on roofs across America, but I don't want the government to dictate that I have to have a solar panel on my roof.
On the issue of guns, you said you wouldn't support any gun control laws that would, any additional gun control laws that would limit ownership among responsible law-abiding citizens, which most people would probably agree with. But is there any form of gun control legislation that you would support beyond what we have on the books right now?
You know, I guess the question has to be, will any of it make us safer? Will any of it have an effect that would be good for the country? In California, California is sort of like the experimental nirvana for Democrats. They do whatever they want in California. They've got it. They've got every bit of gun control they kind of want out there. They haven't banned guns, but they have every bit of gun control they want, including the ban of what everybody's talking about, private sales. But it doesn't seem to have deterred, particularly the San Bernardino couple, from buying guns illegally. They bought the private exchange probably was illegal in California. So I think people that are criminals aren't really deterred by tickets. They're not deterred by laws, rules. Particularly if you're going to kill yourself, you're not deterred at all. So same way with the mass shootings. The thing that's focused our attention on a lot of this have been these crazy mass shootings by white teenage boys for the most part. They're going to die in the attack, so they don't seem to be too deterred whether they break any laws in the process. Most of those guns have been legally purchased, and they either get them from their parents or they go and legally get them. And they're incredibly sad. I mean, I can't imagine how it would be to have my kids, come home and my kids have been killed at school. I mean, it's a terrible tragedy. But I don't know an easy way of fixing it, other than one way we could fix it is by announcing to every potential new crazy boy out there that's obsessed with violence that you're not going to have defenseless areas you can go to shoot kids anymore.
Some
What about
more, fewer safe zones is what you're saying. Gun-free.
You should never pre-announce that your people are undefended. I mean, if you're crazy and you're a killer, either you're a terrorist or a domestic crazy person, they're just sane enough to go where people are defenseless, and that seems to be where they go. Even the San Bernardino killing was done, in a gun-free zone as well. It's not a perfect answer. I mean, it's not that I'm just loving the idea that the only way we can stop it is by defending ourselves, but I just can't think of any other way we're going to fix things like that. Now, some will honestly say we just need to grab up all the guns, and somebody, I think when I was on with an interview recently, they mentioned we should just do like Australia and confiscate all the guns. We have sort of a tradition, and we have a constitution with Bill of Rights, so I don't think we're going to do that, nor do I think it would work. If you ask everybody tomorrow to turn all their guns in, I would obey the law and I'd turn in my shotgun, but the guy that's coming to rob me the next night probably is not going to turn in their guns. So.
How about the president's executive order? What would you do about that?
It's illegal for the president to write law, and he's done it on a number of occasions, and he should be stopped. I think we should sue him in court. The courts aren't as want to adjudicate issues like this, but I think it's particularly dangerous to let a president legislate, and not really just because of what this president's doing or fear of what he might do. My fear is the next president, or the next president, or the president after that. And so it's very important that you not let the president legislate, because then we're getting closer and closer to something where you have too much power, in one individual's hands. Our founding fathers looked to Montesquieu as a philosopher about the checks and balances when we were developing the Constitution. And one of the things Montesquieu said is that when the executive begins to legislate, that a form of tyranny will ensue, mainly because too much power gravitates to one hand. And really the biggest problem I see in government right now, above and beyond all problems, is that the executive branch has grown and grown and grown in both size and scope, but also in power. Not just with this president, but really probably from Woodrow Wilson on. We've allowed more and more power. We allowed an enormous amount during the Great Depression, and then it keeps growing. And a little bit on both sides. You know, the left wants gun control, but the right wants people and record control, you know, an invasion of our privacy to collect our records. And both of them seem to grow in times of fear. And I think there's more fear out there now, and so these are times we have to be particularly vigilant, I think.
How would you use executive action?
To try to undo most of the executive power grabs that we've had by most of the previous presidents, Republican and Democrat.
So, if you were president, how would you bring together what is seemingly described by a lot of folks as a dysfunctional Washington?
Part of I think that I've shown an ability to see issues not based on party. I've worked with the Congressional Black Caucus on issues like criminal justice reform. In fact, if you look at the NAACP's issue list on criminal justice reform, I agree with probably all of it, you know. So I don't see issues with regard to party, and I'm unafraid to compliment and work with the other side. I mean, I was on the news this morning complimenting President Obama on getting the hostages released, and also complimenting him on commuting the sentence of Demarius Thomas's mother. So I'm not afraid to work with the other side. I've worked with Ron Wyden on the other side on NSA privacy issues. I've worked with Democrats in the House and the Senate on issues of trying to end the war in Iraq, trying to end the war in Iraq, not Iraq, in Afghanistan, but also probably in Iraq as well. So, you know, I don't really see issues. I'm not so wedded to party that I can't work with people from the other side.
You mentioned criminal justice reform, and you have a lot of information on your website about that. And one of the measures that you support is to allow judges to deviate from mandatory minimums. So why not just get rid of mandatory minimums?
I'd get rid of them. I would. But I have a bill that gets rid of mandatory minimums completely.
For all crimes?
Yep.
You don't see any place for them for any?
I think really that if you want to find justice, you have to listen to the case, and every case it has some individual characteristics to it. I think we went crazy with things. I mean, one of the objections, like to Ted Cruz, for example, when he was working, I think it was as Solicitor General, a guy stole a calculator, but it was like his third crime or something. He got 16 years in prison for stealing a calculator. And then when he was about to get out, Cruz actually supported his position from the government was, by golly, he needs to serve his time. And I object to that. I think that particularly, you know, I'm at the barber shop today. The owner of the barber shop has, I think he said he had 1 or 2 felony convictions. And he's lucky that he has his own business, but he'd have trouble getting a job in most corporations. In fact, I think the biggest impediment to getting a job in our country is having a criminal record, particularly for African Americans. Many of the harsh sentencing and the rules that were set up to do this were done by Bill Clinton. It's kind of why I've asked Hillary Clinton, you know, today to apologize for incarcerating a generation of young African American men, because Bill Clinton's really responsible for it, with all the 3 strikes you're out, all the increased sentencing for drug trafficking, because almost all the drug users are also traffickers to a certain extent. And look at like Demarius Thomas's mom. She got like 24 years in prison. I don't think she ever hurt anybody. I mean, you can argue that selling drugs to people hurts them, but it's not really a violent crime. The mom got 2 life sentences. The grandmother, I think she's still in prison. 2 life sentences, and it's like you can shoot somebody in Kentucky and be eligible for parole in 12 years. So I think we've gone crazy in the war on drugs, and there's been a really disproportionate impact on minorities with it. And I've become more and more aware of this, particularly after reading Michelle Alexander's Mass Incarceration, the New Jim Crow, that we're destroying a community. When I was in Ferguson, I discovered that for every 100 black women, there are only 60 black men left in the community. And I think many of these people that have been put away for a long time really didn't need to. And many white counterparts got off.
So besides eliminating mandatory minimums, how would you address the war on drugs?
I would expunge records. I would make a lot of felonies misdemeanors. Proposition 47 in California took a lot of felony possessions and made them misdemeanors. What that does is it gets rid of the problem of it still isn't really making it okay but it doesn't give you, the felony gives you the permanent employment problem. The misdemeanor doesn't. And what they've found in California is California prisons were so overcrowded, they passed Proposition 47, nobody's being released early now, which is good because if you're not putting the drug criminals in there, you've got violent people in there. Violent people were getting out early, and now they're not. But I think one of the great things is right and left is coming together on this. There really is a right-left continuum.
What's the
you talk about-
Grassley bill on?
Grassley's bill will help some, but it doesn't get rid of mandatory minimums. It does help expunge some records. It's a step in the right direction. I'll support it. I've spoken with him about letting me have amendments on the bill so we can at least have a chance to make it even better.
Those would be, what would be on mandatory minimums or what kind?
I'll have an amendment if I get to on mandatory minimums. We might do one on voting rights. We might do one on several other things.
Okay.
So,
On expunging records, what kind of things are we talking about there?
after a certain period of time, letting you expunge your records, particularly for nonviolent crime. Most of the people that I talk to, like the guy in the, he's probably my age in the barber shop. My guess is he said in his early 20s. Most of these are crimes. A lot of people do, not a lot of people, but enough, do bad things or things that are against the law in their early 20s. Then they get to about 25, and particularly boys begin to have their brain starts to grow at 25, and they quit doing these things. And then he's been probably an upstanding member of his community for 20 years or more.
I presume you support ban the box?
I support a different approach in the sense that I would prefer, I'm all for voluntary ban the box, but I would rather that we get rid of some of the problem by making a lot of the felonies misdemeanors, so you never have to check the box to begin with.
What do you, I was just gonna ask, what do you say to some of your colleagues that are running for the nomination that suggest that mandatory minimums have actually been an important part of the, or an important factor in lowering the crime rate over the course of the last few decades?
I think it's probably hard to exactly prove, one way or another what has caused it, but crime has gone down. If it meant that we had less crime, but we locked people up for 15 years for marijuana, I'd probably still be against it. But I am for, I think it's a combination of things. So for example, I think having a police presence on the streets is probably a good thing. Having them in communities, having them out there, having them make people feel safe about things. But I don't like the idea that we'd be so aggressive that we're, arresting people for jaywalking. People talked about the broken window thing. You arrest people for everything, lock them all up, and you'll get less crime. You probably will, but you're kind of living in a police state at that point, so I don't really want that. But I'm not against having police out on the street, making it safer, having a presence where people who would commit crimes are deterred from committing crimes. I don't know. I don't think the answer is the mandatory minimums necessarily have brought the crime down. I don't know. See, I think people also commit crimes, because drugs involve a lot of money. Nobody really, you don't see a lot of criminal activity for alcohol.
Can we switch to foreign policy? How badly did Paris hurt your campaign, do you think?
I don't think any of the current events really, I think that's a false sort of narrative have changed anything in my campaign. We have struggled because the race has been dominated, I think, news-wise and everything else by Trump, and the numbers have gone towards him, even though I don't think we have a lot in common. He gets, if you add up all the coverage of all the other candidates and multiply by 25, you get to his coverage. So it's become absurd. You can't turn the TV on without hearing him, and as a consequence, it's dominated people's minds. Then the polls dominate the coverage, and then the question is, are the polls accurate? Well, there's a lot of evidence that they aren't accurate anymore. In my state, in the governor's race, everybody said the Democrat would win by 5, and the Republican won by 8. So they're all 13 in a two-way race with 1 week to go. I don't know. I think it's a disservice. We can't do anything about it, but I think it's a disservice that we've been sort of led so much by the celebrity nature of this race and by the polling, in reality, without trying to wait and let voters make a decision. I can understand if I don't get the votes in Iowa and people don't want to cover me, fine. But really, until then, we ought to be in the debates. We ought to get, and really ought to have equal time in the debates. They shouldn't skew everything all towards, and then what if we spend half the time in the debates talking about, I don't know, just crazy, stupid stuff that he says, instead of really talking about policy. I mean, this is a guy that has no idea what the nuclear triad is, and then when he discovers that we have nuclear weapons, he says, yeah, our biggest problem is we haven't been using them enough. That should scare, Republicans to death that we could get that as our nominee. I'm alarmed that we might have him as our nominee. Still hoping voters will think better.
Yeah, here you are talking about him, so we're
Yeah.
that feeds into the coverage.
Yeah.
It seemed like it worked to your advantage a little bit to skip the undercard debate because you got a lot of publicity, went on a lot of shows. It sounds like the Periscope
It was better
back and
than
forth
it was better than being in the undercard, but it wasn't as good as obviously being in the debate. So I mean, we would lobby very hard to be included in the debate. You know, there's one more debate for Iowa, and it's not fair for the party or the networks to exclude people who have a national campaign. I think it's ridiculous.
So you think all the people that are in the other undercard should be able to be on stage?
You know, I think that if I were doing it, I would say I would look at polls, I would look at fundraising, I would look at paid staff, volunteer staff. I would go to some of their events. Does anybody show up? If you aren't traveling to Iowa and you've never been here and you've just put your name on the ballot, you wouldn't get in the debates. If you didn't have any staff or volunteers, if when you showed up, 10 people showed up, you know, we've been, I think, we've had rallies at Iowa and Iowa State that have had close to 1,000 students show up. Most of our others, we routinely get a couple hundred show up, you know. So I think there are ways to gauge campaigns, but I think we've decided there's only one thing we base it on, just the polling. And so yeah, it would be more inclusive. You know, look, Santorum and Huckabee have won Iowa, you know, caucus before. Santorum won 11 caucuses. I think his mistake was he didn't complain enough about not being in, you know, the debates, because he from the very beginning was pegged as a candidate, basically pre-decided that he had no chance by being put in the second tier.
You've indicated that one of your first acts as president would be to repeal the Affordable Care Act, but I assume you agree that that might create some issues with regard to access to health care. So what would you do to address that?
Right. I think we have more access now, but we have access to something that has become increasingly expensive. You know, if you have more people getting free and subsidized and a shrinking pool of those paying, it's going to have to be more expensive for those who are paying. In our country, we never actually had anybody that was turned away from health care. And that didn't get mentioned enough, but every hospital in America has always accepted, in the modern era, has always accepted everyone for acute care and emergency care. So it is harder for non-acute care in some cases. The biggest problem, though, I think preventing access was expense. And we didn't address expense at all with Obamacare. In fact, I think what we did is actually made expense worse. We also made it illegal to sell inexpensive insurance, and that's one of my main objections to Obamacare. Before Obamacare, you could buy inexpensive insurance. Under Obamacare, he said, well, we call that inadequate insurance, and so we're not going to let you buy that anymore. Well, the problem is that that precludes people from buying something that was inexpensive. When I was in between residencies, I didn't have insurance for about 6 months. I bought insurance for $1 a day. I thought it was a wise thing to have insurance. Wouldn't have covered any of my daily needs, but I wanted it if I got in a car wreck or I got cancer or something happened to me. That should be the choice for young people. But now you have like 10 different mandates for every insurance product. So once you add in the mandates, you know, I always jokingly say, I don't want my teenage sons to have pregnancy coverage. It's not a good incentive for them, you know. But they've all got it. They've all got pediatric dental coverage. Doesn't cover them, but if they have kids, it'll cover their kids. And it's like, that's crazy. So we've added all that expense into them. And really, when you're 21 years old or 22 years old, and let's say you get out of college, you should want a $2,000 deductible. If you don't get sick, next year you should get a $3,000 deductible. If you don't get sick again, $4,000. And maybe what would happen in a real marketplace is maybe half the public, maybe 80% of the public doesn't get sick. It's really higher than that. It's like 98% of the public doesn't get really sick from age 20 to 40. What you would do is during that age period, really even before that, in the ideal world, people would buy insurance with a $500 deductible for their newborn, and it would go up every year, but the premiums would go down. And then you'd get big marketplaces with people in $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 deductibles if they didn't get sick, and they would bid prices down. competition works. Capitalism works everywhere else. But what you have to have is policies that have higher and higher deductibles, but lower and lower premiums, and you need a pool of people. In my medical practice, only about 3 to 4% of the people cared about the price. If they were Amish, Mennonite, or had a high deductible policy, nobody else cared about the price. So if you come into my office and you don't care, and then the doctor doesn't care, what happens? Price is going to go through the roof. The other thing that happens is half my patients, and this is true of a lot of doctors, were Medicare or Medicaid. Well, if government's going to pay for your insurance, do you think the doctor ever is going to underbill you? No, the doctor every time, and it's not fraud, but it's a perverse incentive. The doctor tries to probably maximize what the charge is instead of minimizing it. But if you come to me and you're a Mennonite and say, I only have a certain amount of money, what if I give you $80? Will you see me? And the charge might be $150. A lot of times the doctor will do it for the $80 because prices get bid down. But it's the same with LASIK surgery, contact lenses, anything not covered by insurance, where there's a true marketplace, prices are bid down. And so it tends to work, but you got to figure out how to develop a marketplace to bring prices down. And then also the other thing that would be a big innovation, and I think would also be a good thing, is to sell multi-year insurance. So like term life insurance, if I have a 20-year contract and I have a heart attack halfway through, they don't change my rate. And that was the thing that infuriated people, and me too. That if I have 5 employees and one of my employees gets breast cancer, which is a terrible tragedy, it's like, not only is it a terrible tragedy, then the insurance company comes back and is either going to kick me off or kick that woman off my plan. But what if we had longer term insurance, like, multi-year insurance, I think would be better, because at that point your prices would be fixed. I think the ideal system would be everybody buys insurance at birth, and they try to get, their goal would be to get increasing deductibles each year and then save more money each year in a health savings account that would grow tax-free. Not everybody would be a saver, but quite a few people would, and I think that would be a better system than what we went with.
There was an article that USA Today published yesterday saying that as we get closer to the early voting states, it appears that you're re-emphasizing your libertarian roots. Do you think that's true?
I don't know. I always read these things that say, oh, I've changed my strategy. And if you listen to my stump speech, I've been given the same stump speech since I ran for office in 2009, 2010. So I don't know that it's really changed much. But we are trying very hard to make sure our message gets out. And it is one that has a libertarian-ish bent to it. And we're proud of the fact that I'm the least likely candidate on the Republican side to take us to war in the Middle East. I'm the least likely to put your kid in jail for marijuana, and I'm the least likely to let the government collect your phone records. So those are distinctive things that we think separate me from the field. And so we do try to emphasize those.
In 2012, I was observing at a Republican caucus, and I was just very impressed. The energy, the young people that were out for your father. And one of them mentioned, I really believe when he said, but I really would wish his son ran.
Right.
And how well do you think you've tapped into those supporters, that energy then, now?
We feel it everywhere we go on college campuses. We feel it when we're at our headquarters, and yesterday we were there and we had 75 to 100, almost all college age, many of them there on their breaks, and then many of actually several of them are high school as well. So no, we think we probably have more energy on college campuses than anybody. The only competition we see is from the far left, actually, is from Bernie Sanders on college campuses. But we haven't seen any activity from Republicans on college campuses.
All right, I think we have time for maybe one more question, and then we're going to have to hit the road.
Sure. You said at a campaign stop, I think it was yesterday, that the release of the Americans from Iran was proof that diplomacy worked. So how else would you apply that?
I've been trying to say that we need to be engaged diplomatically and continue that, including with Iran. Now, I wasn't supportive of the agreement, and the main reason I didn't support it is Iran is kind of acting like they want to become part of the civilized world again, but they also have a huge carrot right out dangling before them, the money. My question is, in a year, will this necessarily be there? And it is kind of ironic that the day we release them, we're putting new sanctions on them for something else. And so they're not really obeying the international rules with regards to, ballistic missiles. But I think it is worthwhile when something good happens to admit something good happens. I think we should celebrate them coming home and not, what I object to with some of the other candidates is that everything immediately has to be, oh, this is an opportunity to blast Obama, so he's responsible for them being there for 4 years. In reality, the Iranians are responsible, and we should celebrate them coming home.
Others have said they'd rip up the agreement. What would you do about it?
I think that's a really dumb idea, because my main objective to the objection to the agreement has been I'm concerned whether they'll comply or not. So if the next president comes in and we've got 2 years of the agreement, I would say the first question you ask is, are they complying? If they're complying, see, there's nothing wrong with the Iranian agreement. It all has good stuff if Iran adheres to it. What some of us fear, and this is an unknown, is will they do the same thing North Korea did? You know, North Korea, sort of, we backed off a little bit. We had an agreement. They said they wouldn't develop nuclear weapons, and then they did. Is that the question? Are the Iranians just being clever and devious? Will we back away a little bit, and then all of a sudden they wind up with nuclear weapons, and they're as, you know, ornery as they've always been? And that's unknown. And that's why I kind of wanted to keep the sanctions regime a little more in place, gradually lessen it over a several-year period to see if this is not just an immediate thing that they're doing just to get the money, or whether it really is something where they want to have thawing relations. But I think it is important, negotiation is important, and I'm in favor of it, and I do try to separate myself from the rest of the field who I think are reactionary when it comes to foreign policy. Thanks for having me. What's that?
To wrap up, anything else you would like to say?
Nope, thanks for having me.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Good.